Hi, I am Pratim Ranjan Bose, and you are watching my podcast presented by Iravati Research and Communication Center, or IRCC. My today's guest is Don McLain Gill. Don is a Philippine-based geopolitical analyst, author, and lecturer at the Department of International Studies, De La Salle University, Manila. Welcome, Don.
Thank you very much. It's a true honor to be here.
In this episode, we will discuss the geopolitical significance of India's BrahMos missile sale to the Philippines. The first batch of missiles are delivered earlier this month. The Philippines, as you know, is an archipelago, a string of islands between the South China Sea and Pacific Ocean. South China Sea is witness to many maritime boundary issues. The Philippines also has a long-standing maritime boundary issue with its top import destination and third largest export destination, China. An UN court ruled in Manila's favor in 2016, but Beijing refused to accept it. The two countries are often at news for clashes. As in 2022, India-Philippines bilateral trade was valued at barely $3 billion, which was nothing to when considered against Manila's global trade of over $220 billion at that year. Politically, Manila is an old ally of the US. However, in recent years, there had been some seesaw. Former President Duterte tried to dump the US for China and then made a comeback. The new president, Ferdinand Bongbong Marcos, announced exit from China's Belt and Road and took the country back to the US way. So with that introduction, Don, let me come to you. With BrahMos, India is now very much a party into the South China Sea conflict. How significant is that geopolitically? Over to you.
Well, thank you so much, sir, for having me. It is a true honor. Now, this is, in fact, a very important question and a very important point. And we have to look at this based on the context of the evolving security partnership between India and the Philippines. Now, it is clear to say that since 2016, there has been a surge in the level of momentum and activity between both countries in terms of forwarding robust defense cooperation. And however, despite the prevalence of conducive structural factors since the beginning of the 21st century, the relationship remains stagnant and friendly at best, but still quite limited and marginalized. And since 2016, we can see a huge push in the bilateral relationship because this coincided with President Duterte's desire to diversify strategic partners. And India has been a clear beneficiary of that particular policy, which also coincided with a more robust ACTIS policy since 2014. Now, the BrahMos missile was in fact a cornerstone agreement in this evolutionary trend between the Philippines and India. And I think that this is a clear portrayal that India wants to play a more active role in acting as a security and defense partner and provider in the region beyond the Indian Ocean region. And the Philippines being the first recipient of the BrahMos missile designates, of course, the clear foundations that are being formed in that bilateral partnership. And we asked about the implications of this. Well, obviously, China is not happy with India arming and improving the material capabilities of countries that it seeks to undermine, or whose interests in sovereignty and sovereign rights it seeks to undermine. So this is in fact a clear realization of like-minded cooperation. And with India now trying to ramp up its defense partnership with the Philippines, we could see that India is now realizing of the clear interdependence between the security of the Indian Ocean and the security of the South China Sea. And therefore, as it is continuously growing as an emerging great power, it would have to take more proactive positions to ensure the security of the established order. And being at the front lines of China's belligerence and expansionism, the Philippines is in fact looking forward to working more closely with India. And this is, I think, important given India's also growing defense partnerships with other countries in Southeast Asia.
I agree. I fully agree with you. The other day, I had the former Foreign Secretary Harshvardhan Shringla, and he said that India must display more robust participation in global security framework to not as a purely for its own typically own interest, but also to provide security to others. So, how do you expect the South China Sea situation to evolve from here? China has been in news for maritime boundary clashes with almost every neighbor in that region, if I'm not wrong. Uh, and with all this, we can. I mean, how do you expect it to heat up?
Right. And, the South China Sea is, in fact, one of the most notorious flashpoints in what we call today as the Indo-Pacific. And in fact, this has been a huge problem for the Philippines as well. As early as 1995, when China, in fact, took over a particular reef within Philippine exclusive economic zone. And since then, China has been, of course, increasing its assertive activities within the exclusive economic zones of various Southeast Asian countries. And since 2008, there has been a double-digit increase in China's military spending. And in 2009, that's when China forwarded its 9-dash-line claim to the UN, which marks, of course, a more assertive turn in Chinese approach in the South China Sea. But the reason why it has become so complicated is because of a number of issues that we have to point out. First of all, there is a clear divergence of threat perception within Southeast Asia. So there is what we call maritime Southeast Asian countries and those that are part of the Indochina region, which are more continental. Now, the thing here is that there are various threat perceptions. So, for example, Cambodia and Laos may not look at the South China Sea issue at the same degree as maritime Southeast Asian countries like Indonesia, Malaysia, or the Philippines. And while Indonesia is not party to the South China Sea officially, it's also facing issues with China's incursions into the Natuna Sea within its exclusive economic zone. So clearly, there is a varying degree of threat perception. And even among the claimants, there's also inconsistency in how to approach with this. Brunei has been awfully quiet. Myanmar has been Malaysia has been trying to keep a quiet balance between the US and China. Vietnam also tries to hedge between the US and China in different angles, despite it being assertive in some points, but it still wants to keep good relations with China, having that party-to-party relationship. So it's a different dynamics. The Philippines has, since the end of the Cold War, also been very inconsistent in its foreign policy decision-making towards the greater South China Sea. So it was only in 2010, for example, that the Philippines reoriented its security position towards maritime security. It was always internal security to begin with, despite the China threat. So that's one point. The second point is, as far as traditional security providers are concerned, the US, of course, has been also very much preoccupied with other parts of the world. In the early 2000s, you have seen the preoccupation to the Middle East. And today, there are also concerns among Southeast Asian countries of the US's preoccupation in Europe and again towards the Middle East. And we've seen with the budget breakdown recently, the Indo-Pacific only received a small percentage of the budget breakdown of the US defense aid and all these expenditures. So that's another issue. The third, of course, is China has been consistent in its expansionism in the South China Sea. And I've always argued since the creation of the People's Republic of China in 1949, it has had an ardent appetite for territorial expansion. So as far as China is concerned, it has been the only actor that has been consistent in the South China Sea based on its interests. Everything else was very much variable. And that is, I think, one of the reasons why China was able to have a free run for the longest time. And it is only recently when even other major powers like India, Japan, and Australia are giving more attention to the South China Sea issue. So I think the challenge that is faced now is that China has militarized the South China Sea considerably. And as early as 2018, from the US itself, there was a realization that China has controlled the South China Sea short of war with the United States. And that tells you how China's altered not only the balance of power, but also the geography with the artificial islands and constructing new military bases, etc. So it has become very perilous. But now we are seeing more effort from like-minded partners and major powers, even from European countries, to keep the South China Sea free, open, and rules-based. But of course, given the nature of international politics, this won't be an overnight solution. It would contain a lot of consistency. It would entail a lot of consistency. And that's what we need to look at. How consistent can like-minded partners be in pushing back China's assertiveness? And that's one thing that China always has in mind. It's usually just sitting and waiting. Because for the Philippines, for example, we've had different perceptions towards the South China Sea based on the leadership. So that's another problem. So, these variations have strengthened China's resolve to become more assertive in the greater South China Sea.
I think you have hit the nail on its head that, merely talking about China's expansionism in South China Sea doesn't help. Someone has to come up and fill up the void. So if I'm not wrong, India, just a quick question. It's not a question, it's a known fact that since India has not really expanded or some people in Southeast Asia, they prefer to point out that India has failed. Okay, in the past. Vietnam also probably has some treaties and etc. They also took some defense equipment from India, but of course someone has to fill up the gap. So finally, we are seeing some action over there. So from that standpoint, I'm asking you that how do you see these recent alignments like Quad, IPEF, and particularly the most recently formed the US-China Philippines axis. So how are they going to work? You spoke about budget issues and etc. So how are they going to work, you feel? I think also there is a Philippines parallelly has joined hands with Australia.
Absolutely. And that's one important aspect in order to understand the dynamics of Southeast Asian countries. So Southeast Asian states in general do not want to choose sides. And I think that's a known fact. What they actually need would be more options. More options, more alternatives
I do
to
agree with
expand.
you. I do agree with you.
Yeah.
In fact, I remember I attended the address of Secretary General of ASEAN back in Hong Kong back in 2010. And one thing he said during the lecture and after that is that we are not going to join with anyone. So very focused on economic development. That is
Right.
the character of
Right.
Southeast Asia. They don't want to be aligned politically and ruin their over to you.
Absolutely. Absolutely, sir. I definitely agree. And that's why even the Quad, for example, had to water down its military nature in order to accommodate the interests of other Southeast Asian countries. So you see the Quad now has expanded in its agenda, its scope. So from economics to climate change and energy and all these things. So these are, of course,
Semiconductors.
important things. Semiconductors, and that has become a major issue. For the Philippines, for example, we have one of the largest nickel reserves. And this realization has catalyzed the Luzon Economic Corridor, for example, which was a clear result of the trilateral arrangement between the U.S., Japan, and the Philippines. So that corridor eventually seeks to leverage on the Philippines' resources and to keep it within the supply chains of semiconductors. Malaysia has often been also a beneficiary of such arrangements as well. So these things that you've mentioned earlier, sir, like the IPF, the Quad, and these trilaterals are all aimed at ensuring that Southeast Asian countries are given more options. Because even the US has realized that it's no use pushing them to choose sides. That's not going to happen. What we need is for them to lessen their strategic dependence and the asymmetry that they have
In
on
fact,
China.
that's not merely true for Southeast Asia. I mean, let us look at India. The policy neutrality, the
Exactly.
Russia-Ukraine crisis, and the US sanction and India's decision to stick to Russian oil. So it's clearly, I mean, there is no point in pushing you to be in one group.
Absolutely. And this is why I have suggested and I've written on so many occasions that India presents itself as a natural partner for Southeast Asia because India's strategic autonomy, its understanding of pluralism, for example, the diversity of individual national interests, and not pursuing a value-based foreign policy, but at the same time, a foreign policy based on equitability and democratic values, etc., that are tailored to the Asian landscape makes it a very practical partner. The Russia-Ukraine war issue, for example, India came out to be quite admirable among Southeast Asian countries because they could see how India stood firm, not falling into any particular basket, but standing firm on what it believes in, and that is a people-centric approach that would lead to proper negotiations. And Southeast Asian countries agree with that. So this is one of the major points that India has been gaining attention to, is that its position on various international security issues. So I think that's also very important.
Okay. I think the crucial fact that is coming out of your deliberations is that you were saying about the economic component of the of relations. I mean, that is very crucial. Someone has to come up. It is not merely about your defense budget, but it is about also filling up other economic gaps. So
Absolutely.
here comes the question. I mean, a lot of things now. As I said in the introduction, that China is a big trade partner. Now,
Yes.
and it is quite natural because India is not filling up that gap, or it doesn't have that capacity as yet. The manufacturing prowess of China is beyond question. So, given that, do you think it would be, I mean, picking up a conflict with China? How should it impact Philippines? And is it really possible for Philippines to exit from Belt and Road?
All right, so these are very important points. And we have to first understand in the Philippine context that standing up to China, particularly in the West Philippine Sea, does not necessarily equate to a derailment in economic relations. And as you have rightfully mentioned, despite the fact that the Philippines has been pushing back, its trade still continues to grow with China. And even during the 2010 to 2016 administration of former President Aquino, which was also quite hard in balancing against China, trade relations also continued to grow. So this shows us that Manila has been able to set that economic agenda on one side, but at the same time making it sure that in areas such as the West Philippine Sea, it would not tone down in terms of
Uh,
defending the sovereignty and sovereign
the,
rights.
the point is, it is, I don't think it's about the Philippines, what Philippines wants. Here, the issue is what China wants or can do. I mean, we have seen the world has really changed post-COVID or since COVID. So we have seen China going for export bans or suspensions number of times on various materials, which it knows that which has very serious repercussions. So just giving an example. Similarly, the tariff war and etc. Everything is happening now. The question is that my question was, obviously Philippines is dependent on China,
Right.
economically dependent on China. So, do you think that there is a possibility that this, given the uncertainty of post-COVID scenario and the way things are moving, this is not the same China as we saw 10 years ago,
Right.
which was more focused on trade and economy rather than pushing
Right.
other things out. So, do you
Right.
think that there can be a flashpoint there?
Absolutely. And if we remember not just the Philippines, when Vietnam signed a comprehensive strategic partnership with the US, China decided to hold out its imports of Vietnamese fruits and vegetables,
Right.
tons of that.
There's
And
a
that also
regular
led
issue there.
exactly. So that has been the militarization of economics. And when it comes to the BRI, the Philippines, despite reports, has not exited the BRI. The problem that was faced was China did not follow up on its commitment on the BRI. So because it remained quiet, we had to look for other options. And this shows us that it is not the Philippines, and based on what you have rightfully said, that it's not the interests of Southeast Asian countries to derail their economic relations with China, because it has gone too deep to the point where policy decision making in the economic realm cannot be done without taking into consideration the role of China. But what we are seeing now is that there are selective areas of decoupling. So the Philippines, for example, has now sought the partnership of Japan and the United States for railway projects that were supposed to be given to China under the BRI. So what we are seeing now is that there are selected issues in economic cooperation, development cooperation that could be provided to other partners, such as Japan, Australia. Interestingly, when China, well, the term ghosted the Philippines in terms of its three railway connectivity projects, the Philippines government, in fact, announced that we are hoping that India and Japan and South Korea could provide us with cooperation in railway development. So there's an active looking for partnerships that could provide and fill out certain gaps, selected gaps, which China has often set aside for its partners. So while we cannot decouple generally in terms of economic relations with China, what we are looking at is area-specific decoupling, selective decoupling. In key critical areas such as semiconductors that are happening now with the Luzon Economic Corridor, and of course railway and infrastructure development. So this will be the trend now. But again, it will depend on who sits again after the few years for the next elections, whether they would reverse the policy again or will they continue this. And that's where the issue lies.
Right. It's a very critical issue. So I think another block in this whole construct, which is how Indian economy grows and develops. There has been a lot of attempts in various segments. For example, in semiconductors, we are extremely bullish that in 5 years we'll be there significantly. There are other areas as well where green hydrogen, the Indian Railways is also modernizing at a very fast pace. What are your expectations now to start with? $3 billion trade is pretty minimal. So what are your expectations from India right from now to in over the next 5-10 years? How it should grow?
Well, when we talk about trade relations, particularly, and you've rightfully said that India has not really been faring well in terms of a collective India-ASEAN trade relationship. Well, India and Malaysia, for example, are, India is considered as within the top 15, and now, if I'm not mistaken, in the top 11 in Malaysia's economic trade. But still, the results are quite asymmetric. For example, with the Philippines, with Singapore, India is quite below the top 10, top 11, top 15 mark. But what we're seeing now since 2014 is that there has been an expansion.
We have very strong relations with Singapore, thanks to there are many other things, the service oriented. Right. So we have very strong relationship with Singapore, Indonesia, Malaysia, and also the automobile industry has a lot of footprints in Thailand, right?
Right,
right. So, but Philippines is a little out of this block where I just saw the one interview in Rappler where Indian High Commissioner was Indian envoy was saying that we have some 1-2 lakh of Indians are working there. So that much is, or 40 Indian companies are there, this much of footprint. But what else? What are you expecting?
Well, I think that there should be a more concentrated boost in the pharma industry, which the Philippines has in fact been looking towards under the Marcos Jr. administration. There has been more inclination to maximize pharmaceutical cooperation with India. And I think that what the Philippines could also benefit from is in fact improving the Philippine manufacturing capabilities through cooperation with other countries. And I think that India has the capacity to provide that. And not only in terms of commercial arrangements, but even in defense production, which also will improve defense industry of the Philippines. And this is in line with the 2023-2028 national security policy of the Philippines, and it shows how improving your defense industry can also improve the viability of economic cooperation. So these are the areas that need to be looked at. But of course, if we look at it from a general standpoint, the Philippines is, of course, a net importing country. And this is why it have had issues in rearranging its import sources. China has a clear lead in terms of import sources, and because of its cheap products, the Philippines cannot reroute towards other sources abruptly, because that would cause socio-economic problems, inflation rates, etc. So I think that India has the opportunity to explore these selected areas of cooperation with the Philippines. The Philippines has also been looking to harness cooperation for its manufacturing sector. I think this is something that India could definitely contribute to. We're looking also at digital connectivity, which they are in fact learning quite significantly from India. The ambassador Shambhu Kumaranji has actually signed several MOUs with Philippine agencies to improve digital cooperation, and of course the sharing best practices, which may lead further to better investments. So these are the things that we may need to look into for India and the Philippines to sort of improve the standing of their economic relationship. But I think that the major problem here is that we are just starting to really explore, what else could be done. The Philippines has, in fact, neglected the diversification of economic partnerships since the beginning of the 21st century, and that has led to problems in diversification. But thankfully, now there's more attention to diversification, and I think that that is where India could play a role, as it is gaining popularity also in terms of public opinion in the Philippines.
Yeah, very nicely put. I mean, of course, pharma, digital, and defense, these three areas, India pharma particularly is a very right way to reach out to people. I think India has to build up a lot of people-to-people connect over there.
Right.
It's not very
Exactly.
people have developed certain preferences there about products and
Yes.
services. So
Exactly.
to change that takes its own time and effort. Thank you so much, Don. Thanks for being my guest.
Thank you.
I wish to
Thank
get
you
you
very
time
much,
and
sir.
again.